Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Norwich Bookstore. My name is Penny McConnell. I don't have my little thingy on, but I'm one of the co-owners of the Norwich Bookstore. We're very glad to welcome you all here tonight. Please turn off your cell phones, etc., etc., etc. Exits are there and there. And it's so nice. You can't just run out to get out just because it's so beautiful. You have to wait till 8 o'clock. I want to give you an idea of a couple of coming attractions. Ed Gray, who is a local author from Lyme, is a hunter and a fisherman. He used to write a book called Gray's Journal of, I can't even remember what it was called, but he's written for a long time, Gray's Sporting Journal. It's his first novel, but he has written quite a few nonfiction books about hunting, fishing, and this is a novel. I just said that novel. And that's a week from tonight. 2 weeks from tonight, we have the Confluence. I know very little about it other than it's about the Dartmouth College grant. I think it's a Dartmouth book. It says a collection of essays, arts, and tall tales. It's by a whole bunch of people who have, I imagine, compiled all of these different essays in this book. So, moving on to tonight. It's really a special occasion when we get to welcome one of our very own special customers and friends. It doesn't happen all the time, but when it does, we're really pleased. Professor Dycus is a member of the faculty at Vermont Law School, where he teaches national security law and other courses. He holds degrees from Southern Methodist University as well as from Harvard. He's been a visiting professor at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and a visiting scholar at the National Resources Defense Council in Washington. He's a co-author of the Aspen Case books National Security Law, now in its 5th edition, and Counterterrorism Law, 2nd edition. New editions of both books will be published in 2016. He's been a very busy lad. He's also the author of National Defense and the Environment, as well as a number of articles on environmental and national security issues. Stephen was the founding co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of National Security, Law, and Policy, as well as the founding chair of the section on national security law of one of the, it's too much, as well as the founding chair of the section on national security law of the Association of American Law Schools. His new book, which we'll be hearing from tonight, Soldiers on the Home Front, The Domestic Role of the American Military, was co-authored with William C. Banks of Syracuse University and published by Harvard University Press this year. This new book is about a subject that I know very little bit about, but have thought about the subject ever since 9/11. So I think we're going to have a very interesting discussion as well as learning about the situation. Both, he will do a Q&A afterwards, so start thinking of some questions. The book addresses the domestic role of the military throughout this country's history and looks deeply into how our laws can establish best practices for the future. Have a little piece of a review from the Tulsa World, and I quote, "Drafted in an atmosphere of heightened fear and anxiety, Banks and Dycus demonstrate our current laws and practices codify ambiguities that at times upset the delicate balance between freedom and order. Yet even in these exigent circumstances and in a field full of perplexity, the authors remind us well-grounded and transparent rules for responding to emergencies may offer the flexibility needed to keep us safe and free." It's a very large and interesting subject. Welcome, Stephen.
Thanks, Penny.
You're welcome.
Hi, thanks for coming. I'm glad to have this opportunity to chat about this whole book with you. I began thinking hard about the domestic role of the military right after 9/11 too, and I remember going to the airport and seeing guys in camis and carrying M16s. Same thing at the Canadian border, and that made me think, well, this is important. But I wonder if we need soldiers to be doing this job. That's really what this book is about. This is a love story. It is. Well, it's it's really a tale of a love-hate relationship that the American people have always had with our military, on which we've always, from the beginning, even before, become highly dependent to help us out when we get in a jam, when civilian authorities can't do the job, but at the same time has stepped over the line, out of role, and sometimes compromised the bargain we've struck with ourselves to be both safe and free. What I'd like to do is I'd like to read a little bit and tell you a little bit about the book in broad terms, and then after 20 minutes or so, I'll be glad to answer any questions that you might have. Here's how the book starts. Think of the U.S. military as part of a large cast of characters in a dramatic production of domestic life in America. Troops have always played a key role. They've always stood ready to use their special training and equipment and discipline to help out in emergencies when no one else could. They've served bravely in the midst of hurricanes, forest fires to save lives and property. They've enforced the law when civilian officials were unwilling to do so. And they've helped restore order when civil unrest overwhelmed local authorities. Most of the time, however, America's military forces have remained behind the curtain, out of sight, waiting in the wings for a cue from their civilian director, president, to step out onto the public stage and perform. Everyone in the theater knows their lines and recognizes their costumes, but no one else can play their part. When they have stepped into the spotlight, they've almost always received a standing ovation. And yet, sometimes these soldiers have threatened the very interest that they're sworn to protect. Civil liberties, representative government, the rule of law. So, from the very earliest days of the Republic, we've developed a dependent and yet uneasy relationship with our military. We've embraced our troops at home, but with caution. So, you may remember that the founders of this country were worried when they met in Philadelphia in 1787 about the possibility of a standing army taking over the government. This was a scenario that we'd seen earlier in England that we wanted to avoid. That hasn't happened, fortunately. What has happened here is that civilian authorities have used the military to do things that they couldn't otherwise. That is, to bend the rules, to push the limits of their authority and the law, almost always in times of crisis, or at least perceived danger in wartime especially. So, this book is about finding the right balance between liberty and security, about describing the proper role of the military in helping to guarantee that balance, and in adopting rules so that when a crisis comes and the military are involved, that we can have a reasonable expectation about how they're going to behave. This is a job for the law, and so what I'd like to do is just tell you a little bit of history of our experience with soldiers in the streets, because it's true, as Antonius pointed out, that the past is prologue. We need to know where we've been so that we don't repeat our mistakes. And it turns out it's a really interesting history. It's a good story. The framers of the Constitution, fresh out of the experience of the American Revolution, were concerned about drawing up guidelines for a country that was still really taking shape. In 1787, just on the at the cusp of the Philadelphia Convention, a farmer who served as a captain in George Washington's army led a group of angry farmers in western Massachusetts in what came to be called Shays Rebellion, and scared the pants off the framers. They were aware that they needed to make some provision for dealing with this kind of unrest, which could have been much worse than it was. So they provided in the Constitution for a civilian commander-in-chief, the president. They assigned to Congress the job of writing rules for the regulation of the military. They said that appropriations for the military have to be made at least every other year, not for a longer term. And they said that the Congress has to provide for calling out state militias, what we now call the National Guard, in order to deal with civil unrest, insurrections, rebellions, and so forth. Congress began to do that in 92 rather, and George Washington, who was the president at the time, put that law to work right away with another rebellion in western Pennsylvania. This time, the problem was farmers who made a business of manufacturing and also consuming a good deal of moonshine, big business, which the federal government sought to tax in order to pay off the debts of the Revolutionary War. Well, after several tax collectors were tarred and feathered, courts were closed, it was a real ruckus. President then Washington called up state troops under this new federal law, 11,000 of them from several states, and sent them out into western Pennsylvania, and that took care of that problem. In the years that followed, troops were used from time to time to deal with labor unrest. They were used in the conflicts in the Kansas and Nebraska territories for slavery just before the Civil War. They were used, unfortunately, to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Troops were used during the Civil War occasionally For example, to put down what were called the draft riots in New York City, which killed hundreds of people in 1863. And military forces were heavily involved in intelligence gathering, not necessarily related to the war, but targeting Southern sympathizers. Anyway, toward the end of the 19th century, the militias became the National Guard. The active duty armed forces had grown dramatically by that point. But the military still played only a minor role, except in labor disputes where the Army always intervened on the side of management. And really until after the Second World War. Then troops were used to help put down race riots in Detroit on 2 different occasions and in other places. And in the middle of the Vietnam War, the Army deployed some 1,500 intelligence agents inside the United States to carry out what one congressional committee, the Church Committee, called the worst intrusion on American liberties ever. The Army collected dossiers on 100,000 Americans that we know about. They created blacklists. We don't know what all they did with the information. They targeted a wide range of war protesters and organizations as dangerous, for example, as the National Organization for Women, the NAACP, the ACLU, of course, and others. William Sloane Coffin was a target. Arlo Guthrie, all the usual suspects. Revelations of armies spying on Americans during the war for reasons having nothing to do with security, or at least with civil unrest, but having everything to do with the politics of the war, led to modest reforms in the late 1970s in the form of a couple of laws that limited domestic intelligence collection. I want to get to 9/11 and tell you what's happened since then. But before I do, I want to recall one dark experience in American history where the military was involved, not heavily, but critically involved. And that was during the Second World War, when in early 1942, President Roosevelt approved the exclusion of 120,000 Japanese Americans from the West Coast and their internment, nice euphemism for imprisonment, in camps out in the western and middle part of the country. The pretext for this was that these Japanese Americans, about 2/3 of whom were citizens, incidentally, posed a danger to the United States, that they would communicate with Japanese submarines, that they'd send radio signals, and so would be connected somehow to an imminent invasion of the West Coast. None of that was true, and In fact, the impetus for the exclusion and internment came entirely from West Coast commercial and agricultural interests who saw an opportunity to get rid of this competition, and President Roosevelt was willing to go along. We now know that as early as the spring of 1943, the War Department knew that there was no military necessity for rounding these folks up and holding them. And we know that at least as early as May of 1944, Secretary of War Henry Stimson told President Roosevelt this. And yet, Roosevelt, who, if you do the math, you'll remember was in a presidential election year, feared an adverse reaction from voters in California whom he thought he needed to be reelected. And he delayed for half a year authorizing the release of these 100 and so thousand people. In fact, he approved their release 3 days after the election in November. The Congressional Committee, looking into this some years later, said that the inescapable conclusion is that the delay was motivated by political considerations. So one of the key events in all of this concerned a hapless Japanese American citizen, a shipyard welder in San Leandro, named Fred Korematsu. Korematsu was arrested in Oakland in 1942 for failing and prosecuted for failing to report to one of the relocation centers. And his case, represented by the ACLU, was taken all the way to the Supreme Court. And in the middle of 1944, finally, the court said that Korematsu's conviction was upheld because, the court said, it felt that there was a military necessity for excluding all these people from their homes and imprisoning them for 2.5 years without charges or trial. And that it wouldn't second guess the military in such a time of crisis during the Second World War. So this is this infamous case, Korematsu versus United States, has been on the books, remains on the books today, still not overturned. However, 40 years later, a political science professor from California, a guy named Peter Irons, was writing a piece about the Korematsu case in the Supreme Court. He was very familiar with all the public documents. And he sent a Freedom of Information Act request to the Justice Department to look at the briefs and other materials that had been created in 1944 for this, when this case was in the Supreme Court. So Irons was invited to go to Washington. He did. He reported to a warehouse. He was shown into a large windowless storage room filled with file boxes and told by a disinterested clerk to call him if he needed anything. The clerk left. Here's Peter Irons. I heard him tell this story shortly after, in 1984 actually. Peter Irons reaches for the nearest file box, opens it up, and he pulls out a draft brief to the Supreme Court, written by the Justice Department of the Supreme Court. Now, Irons was very familiar with the filings with the court, and he started reading this draft brief, and he got as far as the second footnote, and he knew that the world was about to change, because let me just read you. Peter Irons knew what footnote 2 in the brief said that was found with the court. The footnote in the draft brief was different. The one filed with the court asked the court to take judicial notice of, quoting here, facts related to the justification for the evacuation set out in a report by the racist Army general who was in charge of the Western Command in 1942. Asked the court to take judicial notice of facts relating to the justification for the evacuation in this report. In the draft brief, it said that this report by General DeWitt was, in several respects, particularly with reference to the use of illegal radio transmitters and shore-to-ship signaling by persons of Japanese ancestry, in conflict with information in the possession of the Department of Justice. In view of the contrariety of the reports on this matter, we do not ask the court to take judicial notice of the recital of those facts contained in the report. In other words, the government's case was built on a lie. The Justice Department had defrauded the Supreme Court. At this point, Peter Irons took this draft brief, he buried it in the middle of 1,000 pages of other junk that he had no interest in, called the clerk, asked him to copy it all, and he headed home. And when he got home, he called Fred Korematsu and explained what he had found. And Fred Korematsu said, "They did me a great wrong." Korematsu then, represented by Peter Irons, filed a suit in the same federal district court in San Leandro where he'd been convicted 40 years earlier, asking for his conviction to be reversed based on the Justice Department's fraudulent behavior. And the court did in fact reverse his conviction. Here's what the court wrote in brief part. The Korematsu case, the 1944 decision, stands as a constant reminder that in times of war or declared military necessity, our institutions must be vigilant in protecting constitutional guarantees. He cautioned that in times of distress, the shield of military necessity and national security must not be used to protect governmental actions from close scrutiny and accountability. I happened to have dinner several years later with the judge, Marilyn Patel, who wrote this opinion. and we talked about the case, and she said to me, now I've been on the bench many, many years now, and she said, of all the work I've done in all that time, I'm proudest of this. Anyway, I mentioned the Korematsu case, still in the books, because now, and let me just say one other thing about that whole episode. The military were not needed, really, to round up all these 120,000 Japanese Americans and lock them away out in the desert. There were hardly any protests. The Japanese Americans complied. They presented themselves peacefully, although military soldiers were used to guard the camps, that's a job that anybody could have done. The FBI could have done this. But on the other hand, it couldn't. This could not have happened, could not have been done, but for the assertion of military necessity, and but for the patina, the appearance that the military had a key role to play here in rounding these folks up and locking them away. Now, fast forward to not to 9/11, but to 2011, 5 years ago. At the very end of the year, Congress passed a measure that said that terrorist suspects, individuals determined, well, it doesn't say by whom, to be terrorist suspects, may be, or to have been, have substantially supported terrorists, may be locked away in a military prison indefinitely, without charges and without trial. If what I just said doesn't seem possible, I didn't misspeak. I said it exactly the way the law reads. This is the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012. So, this law was immediately challenged on constitutional grounds by citizens and non-citizens, journalists, who felt threatened by the law because they might be charged or might be taken into custody and put away somewhere. But the courts that have heard this challenge have not yet ruled on its constitutionality. Now, President Obama signed this law reluctantly. He said when he signed it, we're never ever going to lock a U.S. citizen away under the terms of this bill without charges and without trial. We're just not going to do that. But, you know, folks, President Obama is only going to be in office for another 7 months, and after that, I don't know what President Trump might do. But you might just ask yourself what it would take to round up and deport 11 million illegal immigrants, illegal aliens, or what it might take to round up and confine all of the Muslims in the United States. This law, it appears, on the face of it, would provide authority for President Trump to do that. All right. Let me see how I'm doing on time. I'm gonna wrap this up and let you ask me some questions. The couple of things. First of all, this book was written by two outsiders, Bill Banks and me. We had a lot of help and advice from people in the military, and yet we're looking at the situation from the outside. We're ordinary citizens, really, although we know a good deal about the law and the ground rules as far as they've been made public. And yet, there's a lot that we were not able to discover. We don't know for sure what circumstances might, for example, trigger a declaration of martial law. We don't know precisely when or according to what ground rules the military might be sent out to help if a cyber attack shuts down the electric grid on the East Coast for a while, right? And so on. So here's the bottom line. It is this. We need, and we deserve, as citizens in this democracy, to have some idea what the law is, what to expect if, once again, the military is called out to help in a crisis. And it will be, no question about that. At the same time, those military officers who are called out need to know how to behave. They need to know what's expected of them. And so far as we can tell, the way the law is written now, in most important respects, and the way the military's regulations read right now, that's not the case. The rules do not provide sufficient clarity to be able to say with confidence what's likely to happen in when the next black swan arrives, as they say, the next big unpredictable crisis. So our plea in this book is to take seriously the challenge of examining, clarifying, thinking through, agreeing, at least in general principle, to the ground rules, or at a minimum, adopting some procedures for deciding what to do in the next crisis. Let me stop there. Be glad to answer any questions. Yes, sir.
Whilst we're waiting for some action along the lines that you've laid before us tonight, we live in fear. We live in an atmosphere of hatred, and an atmosphere of fear, and an awareness that our way of life is at risk. Everything that people fought for, everything that we've worked for, is going up in smoke because we do not apparently have either the will or the means to move forward and protect our situation. I've got no problem personally with locking up the Muslims, and I would keep them locked up until we try to find out what the hell is going on and what we can do, very simply, to protect our society. And all of the, with all due respect, sir, all of the discussion regarding the rule of law and procedure is not going to help us when those bombs start falling and cities start living in fear of when the next device may explode in the subway system or elsewhere. So I've got something of a problem with your posture, which I hope you appreciate is said with respect, because I do not think that at this time, whether it's President Trump or, God help us, President Clinton, has to try to guide us out of the mess we're in. I just I basically think that an awful lot of people in this country are angry and afraid. And what the hell are we going to do about it? I'm sorry, I may have gone on too long.
No,
but
no,
I'm
that's, no,
offering this
I know that,
as
that
a
a lot of
suggestion.
people share your views. You know, in a way, and I mean no disrespect here, but and you're absolutely right about the pervasive sense of anxiety and fear that we all experience, especially since 9/11, especially. Americans have never felt so vulnerable at home as we have in the last nearly 15 years now. That's all evidence to me that at least in this respect, the terrorists have won. Their goal is to create that pervasive sense of dread and anxiety, and to persuade us to abandon the values that make the United States so distinctive. That is, the principles of freedom, tolerance, self-government, individual responsibility. Those principles are antithetical to terrorists. So one way to think about this, and I feel anxious too, I really do, but we're in a kind of a baby and bathwater situation. We've got to ask ourselves whether we want to throw the liberty baby out with the terrorism bathwater. And so far, I haven't seen evidence, A, that we need to do that to remain safe, or B, that we should do that to compromise these basic principles to remain free. So I've got, some people looked at this book initially and took it, without reading it, as a diatribe against the military. Well, it's not at all. It's not at all. It's dedicated, in fact, to our men and women in uniform. We couldn't get along without them. But they know their place in society traditionally and in practical terms. They want to play the role that traditionally has been written for them, and we want them to play that role. We want to find the right balance between safety and freedom. It's not easy to do. But what we're suggesting is that the only way to maintain that balance over time is by a commitment to shared values, to the expressed as the rule of law. And you may think, I know it's very common to believe that that the law really doesn't matter when the crunch comes. That the president's going to do whatever he or she thinks needs to be done. It's not true. And I can cite evidence for you going all the way back to President Washington to show that it's not true. It's not to say there haven't been a few exceptions, but every president, every single one, has been very careful to say that they were operating legally, that they were obeying the law, and gone to considerable lengths, with rare exceptions, to follow the law. All right? Yes, ma'am.
Stephen, when you talk about the military in this country, I assume you're referring to the National Guard?
Indeed, and the active duty military.
So I need a little background on both, and I need a little background. To me, the National Guard has never held, I don't know, a lot of, I just don't have any knowledge about them. To me, they're people that go off for a couple of weeks in the summer. I don't know anything, so tell me.
Okay. When the Republic was founded, well, at the time of the Philadelphia Convention in 1787, the Army had only 700 members. Was it? And a tiny Navy. The founders wanted to rely as much as they could on state troops, what's described in the Constitution as the militia. The militia, at the end of the 19th century, became the National Guards, and today the National Guard, as you know, the active duty military is much, much larger now. The National Guards are folks who operate under the leadership of the governors of each of the several states, Army or Air Force and/or Air Force. These are folks who have the same training, same equipment, and operate under the same regulations as the active duty military. They are subject to being called to active service, as so many have been in Afghanistan and Iraq, still serving there. And in emergencies, in domestic emergencies, they can be called into federal service by the president under something called the Insurrection Act, a very clever piece of legislation, which the first part of which was enacted in 1792. And it's clever in this sense. The guards can be federalized and called into federal service either to help out in the states or to help enforce the federal law, but only in limited circumstances spelled out in this Insurrection Act. And here's the neat part. They can only be called out following a proclamation, public proclamation by the president. That's really important. What that means is that there's going to be political accountability in a White House for any domestic deployments of state National Guard troops, right? So, by and large, those troops are not called into federal service except when it's really serious, right? The Los Angeles riots in 1992, for example, Hurricane Katrina, for example, but not so often. Does that help?
Thank you very much.
Okay. And incidentally, until they're called into federal service, they report to the governor, not to anybody else. Okay. Once they are called into federal service, then they fall in the same chain of command that all the active duty military do and report to the president.
How does that work if the governor of a state disagrees with the White House? Let's take the transgender question, for instance, where there's some concern about the states complying, et cetera, et cetera.
The state troops have to report for duty. I'll tell you when this happened. Two times. Interesting. It happened in 1957. when, if you remember,
Can't say.
Susan, I know you remember.
I don't remember, thank you.
Yeah,
I'm not
okay.
even born yet.
And, well.
But I'm from Little Rock, so
Yeah, I know you are.
I know the story.
In 1957, Governor Faubus refused to allow the integration of Central High in Little Rock, and he sent Arkansas National Guard troops out to prevent it, to stop any trouble. President Eisenhower then federalized the Arkansas National Guard and ordered them into federal service and told them to protect the 9 black students against the Ku Klux Klan and other violence in the integration of the schools. Same thing the following year in Oxford, Mississippi. So those were examples of strategic deployments in the face of objection from the states. The troops, the National Guard troops, had to comply. Other questions?
So, Steve, I wonder if this is a comparative question, and part of it is unfair, part of it is maybe more fair. But I'm wondering about when what you're calling the home front is actually the military front as well. So, for example, in modern states that we think of as having at least sharing some of our principles of democracy and freedom and tolerance and all of that kind of thing, but where the military is a very prevalent presence because of the concerns about foreign state actors. I'm thinking of Israel right now, for example, or Europe through much of the 20th century. And how does that change what you're talking about when the military is deployed in country, but doing what we think of as the military's work of defending the country, but is there in a large scale? And maybe the fairer comparative thing is to say, what does it look like in the United States in the 19th century as compared to the 20th century and 21st century? I mean, for 100 years we haven't had a war on American soil, and what does it look like in the 19th century when we're having wars on American soil and the military has to be an active military presence in country?
Well, we only had 2 wars on American soil, both in the 19th century. I don't think, I think the critical concern is what the gentleman referred to a moment ago is the sense of danger, the threat, real or perceived, in the country, and the ability of non-military or civilian authorities to deal with that threat in a reassuring way. So Israel is an interesting example because they have, in spite of the wall and all, they still have fairly porous borders, and they have folks coming into the country and presenting a real threat, one that the civilian authorities probably couldn't fully deal with. On the other hand, their next door neighbor, Egypt, has seen soldiers in the streets there for decades, right? Under Mubarak, the country labored under martial law for decades, when in fact there was no serious threat, internal or external. to the military were used in that instance as a measure of political control.
They're not pretending to be a democracy.
Well, okay. Well, sometimes they pretend.
All right, we'll have an election and Mubarak wins by 95% again.
Yeah.
But
Does that?
yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just, I mean, even if you think of this country in the 19th century and during wartime, on American soil, the military commandeering facilities for domiciling soldiers, commandeering facilities for hospitals.
Yeah. We dealt with that in the domiciling part we dealt with in the Third Amendment. The requisitioning, we've done some, the government has taken property for military use, but it's always paid for it, right? At least since the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, 1816. And Andrew Jackson tore down barns and fences to fight the battle on the Chalmette Plain there.
I mean, I guess I'm just wondering about this question of limitations on military rights and how that changes when the war is in your country rather than somewhere else. That's my short question.
Okay. Well, even I guess maybe the best the best historical example for us is the Civil War, which was fought on our soil. And even during the Civil War, President Lincoln was very mindful of the protection of civil liberties. And he reined in his Secretary of State and Secretary of War, who otherwise would have been much more aggressive in collecting intelligence about Southern sympathizers and imprisoning many of them. And immediately after the war, in a famous case in the Supreme Court called Ex parte Milligan, the court decided that the military could not imprison and try a civilian, a Southern sympathizer named Landon Milligan, because that was a job under the Constitution reserved to Article III courts, to civilian courts. Right? They're just several months after the end of the greatest war. So the commitment to separation of military from civilian affairs is long-standing and deep.
Lots to think about. Thank you very
Good.
much.
Okay.